All right, everyone, if we could get started on our third and final panel here of the Stevenson Conference. Let me begin by just simply thanking, of course, the Miller Center, the Stevenson family for sponsoring this, and of course to Anne for coordinating and bringing this together. When Anne approached me about participating and serving as a moderator, my first reaction is, I have no expertise in China whatsoever. But when she told me the topic of this panel on climate, technology, and really fundamentally issues around democracy, this was right in my wheelhouse, and I was really excited to have the opportunity. So before I introduce our panelists, I just wanted to share a personal anecdote that helps motivate, I think, this topic here. So I had a book come out about 1.5 years ago called The Decarbonization Imperative, where we're looking at the need for these various technology transitions to occur to be able to address climate change, everything from electric vehicles to renewable energy and the like. And as I was out promoting that book, doing interviews, I was very surprised, and maybe I shouldn't have been, but I was very surprised that I kept getting a thesis that went the following way, that when you think about our free market economies and kind of our messy democracies in the West, and in particular the US, that we are actually incapable of dealing with a hard, complex issue like climate change. And often it was followed up with a note to the East, and particularly China, to say, China is much better positioned to address these complex issues. So I'm very excited to have a panel with us today to maybe help us unpack that thesis and that question. So to my left here immediately, we have Joanna Lewis. She is the Provost Distinguished Associate Professor at Georgetown University and the Director of Science, Technology, and International Affairs Program, and author of the recently published Cooperating for the Climate. Scott Moore, to her left, is Director of China Programs and Strategic Initiatives at the University of Pennsylvania, and he also is an author of a new book called China's Next Act. And then last, but certainly not least, coming to us via Zoom, we are very excited to have Angel Xu with us. She's an assistant professor of public policy at UNC and the founder and director of the Data-Driven Enviro Lab. So we're very excited to have all three of you with us here as we unpack these questions. So to start off with, really just want to kind of get a tale of the tape, if you will, here. What's your perspective on China's current standing as it relates to clean tech and as being a clean tech leader? And where do they stand relative to other nations like the United States? And in particular, relative to where we need to be to meet our decarbonization challenge? So you want to start us off?
Sure, happy to. And it's great to be here. Thanks everyone for joining. You know, I think when we look at China and its accomplishments, particularly in the clean energy sector, I mean, China is far and away the biggest deployer of almost all of the low carbon technologies that we're going to need to address climate change. You know, China is almost 400 gigawatts of solar. To give some scale, that's over twice of all of Europe and almost 4 times of the amount of solar we've deployed here in the United States. So in terms of getting these technologies, you know, out into the field, China is far and away a global leader. And of course, they're also manufacturing a lot of these technologies that, you know, increasingly the rest of the world relies on. And I know we'll talk about later about sort of the broader geopolitical implications of that. And, you know, when you look at sort of the innovation piece, right? So we know China's great at manufacturing, but where do they stand on the innovation we're going to need to really get to the next generation of climate technologies? You know, that's where we've actually seen quite a bit of shift. I mean, a lot of these technologies that China's now leading the world in, wind, solar, even battery technologies, were originally developed by a lot of inventors in the West. And the old model is that China's been really good at adopting these technologies and manufacturing them locally, and the scale that they've brought to manufacturing has driven the cost of these technologies down, which has made them more affordable to the rest of the world. So that on that side, it's good, you know, but we see a lot of improvements in innovation in China so that it's actually shifting, and we see particularly in the forefront of new solar technologies, new battery technologies, where China is sort of on the cusp of developing many of these new technologies. And so, you know, I think we see the country really shifting from sort of a technology follower, as it were, adopter of other technologies, to really starting to be an innovator, specifically in this clean energy space. But, you know, when we look at broader global climate goals and China's role in all of this, you know, China has ambitious climate targets on paper, but when we look at what's been happening in the energy sector, particularly with coal, because coal is still dominant in China's energy system, Last year, China approved the construction of more coal-fired power plants than they have in the last 7 years, and almost twice the amount that were permitted the year before. And China has a goal to peak overall carbon emissions by the end of this decade. This decade, the 2020s, is really what scientists call the pivotal decade for addressing climate change, because if we don't start to get on these ambitious emissions pathways, we are going to rule out our ability to avoid the most dangerous impacts of climate change. So what China does, is really important in these next few years, right? We don't have a lot of time, and so the fact that you see the government approving the construction of new coal plants is somewhat, not only is it concerning, but it just goes against sort of the real progress that they've made in the clean energy space. And there's a lot of reasons why this has been happening. A lot of it has to do with inefficiencies in the power system, and just the way that they've designed incentive structures. But so, I think you have these two sides, I guess, of China's picture, kind of the cleaner and the dirtier side.
We'll definitely want to return to that. Scott, your sense of where China stands in the clean tech revolution.
Well, thanks so much, Mike, and thanks to Ann and the Miller Center for bringing us together. It's a great opportunity. Mike, advance apologies. I'm going to deploy a tried and true DC tactic, which is to answer the question that I wanted you to ask, as opposed to the question you did ask. And that's really
keep coming back to this. Yeah.
And that's really about sort of how we got here when it comes to the U.S. And China, and what it means for climate change, which is not far off from the question you did ask, I hope. And I think if you boil down what's happened over the last 7 or so years with the U.S. China relationship, it's that political leaders on both sides have decided that gains from trade are less compelling than perceived risks to national security. And that is very unfortunate in many ways for climate change, and certainly and especially for cooperation on climate change, because in principle, there is a very compelling gain from trade to be realized from utilizing China's manufacturing economies of scale. Joanna has written extensively about this and just referenced it in her remarks, to produce the clean technology that the world needs to decarbonize, using primarily, or at least in large part, foreign intellectual property. In practice, that gain from trade is very difficult to realize for a variety of reasons, not least the growing geopolitical competition and rivalry that is multidimensional and that we've heard discussed in the panels earlier here today. That leaves us in an interesting place, which is how we can make progress on climate change, where China is an absolutely critical actor, 27% of global CO2 emissions, approximately a third of global greenhouse gas emissions, twice that the contribution of the United States, against this backdrop of geopolitical competition and rivalry. I do think there are ways to make progress on these shared challenges in this sort of paradigm of rivalry and competition, but it's suboptimal. And I think we have to think carefully about the balance of that competition and cooperation, and whether and how we can realize at least some of these gains from trade that are in principle very compelling for climate change as well as more broadly.
I think you addressed the question there, so that was good there. And I definitely want to come back to the rivalry question. But Angel, I'd like to bring you in the conversation. Same question I started with, though. You could take Scott's lead and take it in a slightly different direction if you so choose.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks so much to Ann for inviting me to join virtually. I'm really bummed to not be there because Joanna and Scott are both really old friends and would have really liked to be there. But I'm actually here in Germany at the New Climate Institute, and they have developed a project called the Climate Action Tracker. So they evaluate countries' pledges for the Paris Agreement and then evaluate their ambition. And so I was just checking on this site earlier today and having some conversations with colleagues here about China's efforts on climate change in preparation for this panel. And it's really surprising because they have rated China's pledge as highly insufficient, despite all of the progress that Joanna has mentioned, where China is clearly leading the world in terms of clean and renewable energy, both installed capacity and also in terms of investments. And so it's really, I think, as Joanna alluded to, this conundrum and two sides of this very messy and complicated picture of what China is doing in some areas on climate change and what they're not doing in others. And so I think if we look at just the policies that China has put in place, what they pledged to do internationally, and then adopted those targets and translated them into domestic law, what we're seeing is that there's still a lot of room for China to be much more ambitious. Still, about 60% or 80% of their entire energy mix is reliant on fossil fuels. And as Joanna mentioned, with building coal-fired power plants every single day, it doesn't seem like, at least in the short to midterm, they have a clear plan for transitioning away from coal. And that's what we would have really liked to see, in addition to that peaking year target by 2030, a clear plan for them to decarbonize. And so right now they have this pledge to reach carbon neutrality by 2060, and that's going to require them by 2050 to completely decarbonize their electricity sector. So we can see that it's still incredibly difficult and challenging for them ahead, especially because coal still comprises about 58% of its electricity generation. So still a lot of work to be done. I will just add one other shining point, though, in addition to what Joanna articulated, everything that they're doing on wind and solar. I mean, they're manufacturing 2/3 of the world's solar PV, and more than 70% more than 70% of wind turbine technology, 99% of electric buses. And I think one story that has been emerging in the last few years is the electrification story in terms of transport in China, that I think could really serve as a model for other countries, including the United States. And so my colleague, Debbie Seligson, who's a professor at Villanova, just wrote an excellent blog on this. She was one of the few that was able to travel to China during this zero COVID period. And so she wrote an excellent blog sharing the story. But as she says, China now has 45 subway lines. And so that's really huge. And every third car sold in China is electric, compared to less than 10% of cars sold in the United States. And that's still a doubling from the previous year in the US context. And from different types of transport, electric two-wheelers and delivery trucks and vehicles, they're all electric now. Taxis are also electric. So this is a huge story that is not necessarily being discussed enough, and where China really has made enormous strides in the last few years that I think other countries could adopt, and where we need other countries to also head in urban areas in particular, where transport is a major source of emissions. So that's, I think, an area where China is leading, and that is not often as told as much as the clean energy story on wind and solar and hydro and some of these other technologies. So I'll just leave it at that.
I'm curious, I'd like to push you all on this notion of, there's at one level this clean tech transition we're seeing and the new technologies emerging, and then there are individual nation states' needs to decarbonize. Are these correlated or related, or could China have it both ways? Could they be maybe even a laggard on terms of their decarbonization as a country, and yet still kind of win the clean tech future? And I'll share one brief anecdote. I did some work on patenting efforts, and when the Germans put in the feed-in tariff for solar, one might think that Germany then would become a leader in solar technology. But what we saw instead was innovation in Silicon Valley leading to manufacturing in China with installation in Germany. So do these two things, decarbonization at the nation and then trying to lead the tech future here, are they correlated and related, or could China actually separate these two things out? Joanna, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, a lot of these clean energy technologies, which we all rely on today, were developed through a global innovation system, as you alluded, where, maybe, solar originally developed in the United States, but really was only able to achieve global scale through manufacturing scaling in China, which has driven down the costs by well over 90%. And we see this across a whole variety of technologies, so not just sort of the big renewable technologies we focus a lot on, but in a lot of my work, I interview companies from the U.S. and Europe and try to understand sort of why are they working in China? What is the advantage? And, you see a lot of companies that they have these great ideas, that they would like to get out into the marketplace, and they haven't found opportunities to demonstrate these technologies, often sort of newer technologies in the US or European context, because the Chinese government has been so strategic about developing its own national innovation system, and having particularly funding available for demonstration projects, really trying out new technologies. We see a lot of US companies that were able to demonstrate. I mean, for example, there's one company that had an air pollution control technology placed on coal-fired power plants. There's no better place to demonstrate this than in China, to improve air pollution. And then they were able to commercialize this technology, sell it back to the United States and around the world. And so, I think we sometimes forget that, like, when you think globally about innovation, companies sort of go where it makes sense and what allows them to produce these technologies, in the most cost competitive way. And I think we're in a world now where we're starting to kind of uncouple that, all of our economic systems, but also our innovation system. And we have to be very careful and thoughtful, I think, about that, because, we have benefited from different contributions of different countries to getting these technologies economically competitive. I mean, right now, in most countries in the world, it's cheaper to build a wind farm or build a solar farm than it is to build a coal-fired power plant even. And that's new. I mean, that's just been a shift in the last few years. But those costs are going to change if we start if every country decides we want locally manufactured technology, and there's very good reasons for that. Everyone wants green jobs and local economic benefit. But then you start building these sort of redundant supply chains, and that could have implications for sort of the overall competitiveness of these technologies.
I'm sure we can return to the idea of like tariffs on solar panels that the U.S. has put in place. Scott?
I think what sort of helps to square that circle is that from a sort of global perspective, China is arguably the hardest part of the decarbonization nut to crack for two main reasons. I mean, certainly there's sheer size of the Chinese economy, but more than that, it's the share of China's economy that's made up by emissions-intensive, energy-intensive manufacturing on one hand, and the historic dependency on fairly abundant and yet especially dirty burning supplies of domestic coal. And it's that sort of combination of factors that makes decarbonization of the Chinese economy a particularly heavy lift. And I think that kind of gets to where two things can be true when it comes to China and climate change. One is that there are incredibly ambitious policies that are being undertaken, lots of exciting innovation. I think as Angel mentioned, the kind of electrification story in China's transport sector is really interesting and exciting in global perspective. And yet it's still far from what we would want to see from a global climate standpoint. And I might sort of hasten to add that the two kind of signature sort of headline climate commitments that China has made, number one, to decarbonize the Chinese economy on a net zero basis by 2060 and to peak its emissions before 2030. Both are great and very important. The slope of the curve after 2030 in terms of China's emissions makes essentially all the difference as to whether the world will meet the 2-degree target set in the Paris Agreement for limiting average global temperature increase over pre-industrial levels. So I think what sort of helps us square this circle is that two things can really be true. We're talking, very ambitious policies that will, I think, move us much further down the global path to decarbonization, and yet the kind of road there is rocky. And it matters a lot how quickly China gets there. That matters as much as whether they get there in some ways.
Thank you. Angel?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that Joanne and Scott said. And I would just add that this is what we're seeing in terms of making industrial policy a core part of climate change efforts is one, I think, huge success story coming out of China. And now we're seeing it ironically being replicated in the United States with the Inflation Reduction Act. I think there was long recognition. I remember I was working at the World Resources Institute in DC in 2007 when the Waxman-Markey bill passed, and there was so much energy on the Hill because we were like, yes, finally we're going to get a national climate change bill past Congress. And then it didn't happen because Obama prioritized healthcare. And I think what was included in that particular piece of legislation, talking about cap and trade and putting emissions limits, and there were some punitive measures or could have been seen by companies as being punitive, and that just simply didn't work politically. And so I think flipping the narrative and having the opportunities with respect to incentives for consumers and also for industry to try to bring some of the green tech and clean technology manufacturing back to the United States has really, I think, invigorated a lot of excitement in the United States. And it's almost borrowing a page from China. And Joanna is absolutely right. In the IPCC, we noted in Working Group 3, which I contributed to, that because of China's efforts, the cost of solar concentrated solar photovoltaic has just been reduced globally 85%. And same thing with wind. Also, the cost of these technologies more than 30% over a 15, 20-year time period. And so thanks to China's efforts and realizing that there's this linkage between industrial policies at home and being able to then build the capacity and the technologies that all the rest of the world requires in order to meet the 1.5 degree Paris goal is absolutely beneficial. And so I think what we're seeing now is also a lot of pressure for China to, in terms of its own domestic targets, to make them more stringent. When they initially made that announcement in 2020 at the UN summit that they were going to pledge carbon neutrality, they didn't say anything about overseas emissions. And China, through overseas financing, the Belt and Road Initiative, I think, is the most visible one that was started in 2013. But they have two huge development banks that are pouring billions of dollars into energy infrastructure overseas. And in Southeast Asia, where I was most recently living for 5 years, that most of the projected growth in coal is happening in Indonesia and a lot of these Southeast Asian countries. And so now there's been a lot of pressure. China did say that they would stop overseas investments of fossil-fired electricity infrastructure. And so I think there is, I think, just because of the globalized way that climate change works and operates, that we have to really, there's been a lot more pressure applied on China to tighten up its definition of its carbon neutrality pledge.
You know, you mentioned industrial policy, and I think that's at the heart of maybe the question, the anecdote that I started with, this idea that China is able to say we have these 5-year initiatives, we go after certain technologies like batteries, like EVs, like solar. The U.S. is now getting into that game in a way it hasn't been in half a century or so. If we look forward from this point, kind of like we did in the last panel, who's going to win? How do you handicap the race here to kind of win the clean tech future? And maybe to go a little bit deeper, how would you even define kind of winning the clean tech future for these various nations? I'll just keep going down the list.
Sure. I mean, it's a great question, right? And it's sort of the question of the day. I mean, maybe I'll start with the second half of sort of how we define this, right? And there's a lot of metrics and things we can sort of think about to understand, where do China and the U.S. sort of stand in this clean energy race, as it were. I mean, and as I mentioned earlier, China has really made massive strides, not just in the manufacturing, which we all sort of know that they do very well, but in innovation. I mean, and you can look at patent numbers, I think a lot of the concerns in China had always been patent quality. They have a very different IP protection system, different criteria for patenting. But just in the last few years, for example, in the solar area, you see about 80% of China's solar patents have some kind of internationally recognized patent associated with protecting them as well. And people who study these things, you see that as a potential measure of patent quality, right? And so this is new. I mean, this was, when I was researching China's wind industry, China, far lagged the rest of the world in terms of new patenting, because most of their technology had been, their IP had been essentially licensed or purchased from other countries, and that's no longer the case. And batteries, as I mentioned, is really going to be that next frontier for innovation. But I think when we look at what the U.S. is doing with the IRA, I mean, it's very strategic, right? And as Angel alluded, we've seen this really big shift since I first came to Washington in these market-based, climate policies, trying to get a cap and trade bill through, to this more industrial policy for those of us who work in China, which looks very familiar. And but the U.S. is doing it sort of, with U.S. characteristics. And the rationale being, we don't want to be reliant on any one country in any major way for any technology, right? And when you look in the clean energy supply chain space, there are a lot of concerns, right? And China, it represents over 50% of production if you look at sort of individual supply chain elements: solar wafers, solar polysilicon, solar cells, modules, wind nacelles, blades, battery anodes, cathodes, and the list on and on and on, where China has the dominant supply chain manufacturing and production capacity globally. And the US looks at this and says, okay, if we're putting in place domestic policies to build out these technologies, more electric vehicles, more solar, we don't want to be reliant just on China to get these things. It's not, they see that as potentially a risk to our economic and national security, which makes sense. But so what is the alternative? Do we build all these things domestically, right? Or do we friendshore, as has been talked about? And then where do these countries go? A lot of my research now looks at actually, where could you build these new supply chains if not China? And it's really hard because we're not only looking to move supply chains. Remember, these are all things that are going to scale up 900%, 1,000% in terms of how much of these technologies we're going to need to meet global climate goals in the next few decades. So you're not just moving things; you're substantially increasing capacity. Very few countries are currently well positioned to manufacture these things locally, and so it's actually quite a lift to think about how we do this.
Just a quick follow-up on that. If we have so much scaling need, then maybe these kind of dramatic percentages that come through China, are they almost irrelevant because we're going to have to scale so much, it's going to naturally cause either domestic or at least, as she said, neighborhood friends to take some of this on?
Yes, I do think that's in part true. I mean, some of the work that we've been doing is, and because especially because China's going to be building out a lot of this capacity, right? And I don't think we care if China buys their own technology, right? And that's, and that would actually be a good thing. I think the real tensions are going to be over the sort of the developing world, the emerging economies, because when you look at where most of this new capacity is actually going to be built out, it's actually not the U.S. I mean, our energy system is only going to grow incrementally, and a lot of it's replacing other technologies. But when you go to Southeast Asia, to Latin America, to Africa, these are where you need to be deploying large amounts of these technologies for these countries to make a clean energy transition. And right now, they are going to be relying on China. And then the question is, what are their other options? And then what, will that make the technology less affordable? Because, again, there's a very short time frame to not surpass our global climate goals.
Scott?
I'd pick up on that. It's possible for both sides to win in this scenario. It's also, and I'll come back to how I think that scenario might play out. It's also very possible for both sides to lose. And I think, unfortunately, that's, sort of where things are currently headed. I think a very unfortunate truth to a lot of the U.S. sort of policy measures that have been undertaken, to sort of in the bucket of decoupling, whether or not you want to use that term, hurt both the U.S. and China, but they hurt China more. And that seems to be the point. Unfortunately, when it comes to climate change, this is not what we want. That's not what we want when it comes to clean technology development and deployment. I think two scenarios could sort of unfold, and I think both are in the rubric of China's decarbonization target, and I think it's important to kind of emphasize this, will transform the Chinese economy. And that is true even if it is not fully met, though I expect it will be. It's technologically and economically achievable, fiscally achievable, I'll say. So I expect it will be met, but even if it's not, it will transform the Chinese economy. And in the process of that transformation, and one little fact I think it's interesting to keep in mind when it comes to the Chinese economy is China's carbon intensity. So the quantity of carbon dioxide emissions required to produce a unit of GDP is double that of the European average. China's economy is incredibly, incredibly carbon intensive and energy intensive. So decarbonizing it is a huge transformation. That's going to generate a ton of innovation and investment in clean technology. The question against the backdrop of this sort of geopolitical rivalry and tension is, does China sort of achieve domestic innovation to meet that target, which is possible? In which case the barriers that we've erected will prevent that technology from being deployed outside China as efficiently as it might have otherwise. Or does China not innovate at the pace that it needs to meet the decarbonization target, and it can't access the clean tech that's being developed and deployed and innovated beyond its borders? And that's just as bad an outcome. I will just quickly say, I think the more optimistic take on this, though, and I think Joanna's comments sort of speak to that, is you do see in the Inflation Reduction Act the best example of this sort of idea of competition. And by the way, in his message to Congress saying, if you pass this bill, I will sign it, President Biden specifically referred to the need for the IRA to equip the United States to compete more effectively with China. China was an explicit objective of passing the IRA. That kind of mobilization of public support and investment for clean energy, clean technology development and deployment, can be powerful. I don't think competition with China is necessarily the best reason to want to invest in it, but if it gets us a 40% reduction in U.S. emissions, I'll take it. And I think we see some tentative signs on the Chinese side too, that this sort of idea of competition in the clean tech and clean energy space maybe sort of jump-starting additional investment and resource mobilization on China's side. So to the extent that that gets us further down the line when it comes to decarbonization, it can be helpful even if it's not the best or cheapest or most efficient approach.
Just follow up on this notion of like industrial policy at one level could be used to try to spur innovation and investment in that home country. But to your point, the IRA goes many steps beyond that to say explicitly you cannot source basically from China there. And to your point about kind of the global supply chains and as they're evolving, are what we're doing at the end of the day maybe like penalizing Africa or some of these other countries that might be part of that broader supply chain? I think my numbers are correct on this. Lithium is produced in a variety of locations around the world, but like 90% of it right now goes through China for processing. Is it smart at the end of the day to be playing not just the industrial policy game, but this industrial policy game specifically to penalize China?
So this is where I think it's like principle versus pragmatism. In principle, as I mentioned at the outset, there's an incredible gain from trade to be realized by using China's manufacturing economies of scale to produce the clean technology we need to decarbonize, using largely, if not, or mostly foreign intellectual property. However, intellectual property theft, market access restrictions, a whole litany of, practical barriers preclude that. And as a practical matter, I think at least in the US and increasingly in Europe as well, this idea of competition, especially with China, is proving potent for mobilizing, sources, for mobilizing political support for public investment in clean energy, clean technology. I would add just as a closing thought, and I talk quite a bit about this in my book, China's Next Act, but I think the value of competition is actually even more. We haven't talked about sort of like the whole adaptation side of climate change, but I think it's even more important on that side of the ledger, where I don't see any prospect of mobilizing significant sources of financing for adaptation, absent essentially this idea of competition. And we're competing with China for hearts and minds across the developing world. And I think that's the only practical reason or practical way that you're going to see increased investment for adaptation, even though, again, not the best reason to do it.
Angel, kind of similar questions, who wins, but also this question of, is it smart for us to be engaging in this very explicit, let's penalize China policy?
Yeah, it's hard to add more than what Joanna and Scott have already said, but I will say that I am not sure if it's entirely helpful to frame it in these types of zero-sum kind of, either we compete or we don't. And because I think realistically, if the framing of competition, as Scott said, helps to inspire this race to the top, I think that that's exactly what we need. So there was a recent report that was published by the International Energy Agency, and it was talking about what investments are needed in clean energy in order to transition to net zero by mid-century 2050. And this is what the climate science scenarios say that we have to get to if we want to keep this 1.5 degree goal within reach. And we have to essentially invest an additional 40 trillion in the global energy sector between 2021 and 2050. And so that translates into a 70% higher than average annual investment in the global energy sector than we've seen over the past 5 years. And so realistically, we kind of need everybody to be competing with everyone, and not just US and China. We need everybody to be ramping up their investments in clean energy if we want to be able to keep this 1.5 degree goal alive. And I guess just to push back a little bit on what Scott was saying, I wonder if this, and I know, Scott, you were also saying that we need cooperation as well. And I think you're not like leaving that out of this range of conversation. But I think one risk, and we saw this most recently at the COP27 negotiations in Sharm el-Sheikh, which I attended last November, and Scott was there too, is that with so much of this rhetoric around competition and framing things in these very contentious light, I think what we're seeing internationally, that there are ramifications for global cooperation. I think the United States has wanted to cooperate with China in isolation of other geopolitical trade issues But China has signaled its unwillingness to just cooperate on climate change in a vacuum. And in the U.S. China relationship, historically, environment and climate change cooperation has been seen as a bright spot. And I think that the Chinese are increasingly signaling their own willingness to do so. So Minister Shi Zhenhua, who was the head of the Chinese delegation, brought up the sovereignty issue and brought up Taiwan during a climate change speech at the COP27 negotiations. And that was the first time that we've ever seen China bring up one of these other issues. And that was the primary reason for US and China stalling conversations on climate with Nancy Pelosi's visit of August of that year. And so I think what we're seeing is that this competitive rhetoric is now bleeding over to this traditional bright spot in US China relations. And now at the international level, when I go to these conferences, people are not necessarily looking to US and China to be the lead on global cooperation on climate change anymore, whereas they were absolutely critical in securing the Paris Agreement in 2015. It was China, US coming together, breaking this historic impasse, both committing to emissions reduction limits, with China being an intensity base, as Scott has mentioned, and also this peak emissions, and US, of course, having an absolute reduction in emissions. But now you go to these conversations and the conversation has just moved past. And so US and China is seen, just having them is really the floor of what's expected, that they come, they show up, but no one is necessarily looking at them to raise the ambition. And I think that's really disappointing, because the two countries together comprise more than 40% of global emissions. They're the G2 of global climate cooperation. We need them really working together. And I fear that having so much competitive dialogue, even though, as Scott said, it's incredibly useful to inspiring domestic actors. And I think all of that is very useful on some level. But I wonder if now we're starting to see some of the ramifications of approaching it from that very aggressive mindset of trying to contain the rise of an autocratic China is now affecting our ability to achieve more ambition at the global scale.
Thank you for that. Thank you to Alfred, who just brought me some of the questions. If you have additional questions, please keep bringing them to me. I will get to them in a second here, but I do have a follow-up question for Angel, and then I'm going to maybe bring it back the other way here. I think this is a really important theme around cooperation versus competition. And if I take a big picture, look at this, we've had roughly 50 years or so where the dominant policy, not just in the US, but kind of globally, has been this notion of breaking down trade barriers, allowing for more free trade, allowing for, as economists we call comparative advantage, let China do manufacturing, let us do innovation and the like. And now we're moving into a much more kind of regional fighting between different countries and different areas for dominance here. And I just wanted to add one other piece to the puzzle, which is the EU. And as you probably saw just this week, the EU is moving forward with the border adjustment tax, given some of their climate policies here. You're sitting in Germany right now, I think this is what you said. How does this play out if now, they're starting to put trade barriers up between the EU and the US and China as we try to kind of both solve the climate crisis and try to be dominant players in this emerging clean tech economy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just, again, points to how complex global cooperation on climate change is. It's been referred to as a super wicked problem, and multilateral cooperation. We're going into the 28th COP, Conference of Parties. So there's been close to 30 years of these kinds of negotiations. And as you can look at the global emissions data, emissions are just going up every year. And so I think this is one of the reasons why in my research, I'm now looking at the potential for subnational and private actors to fill in some of these gaps, because we know that cooperation goes into these various cycles of competitive modes and then more cooperative modes. And you see that there are tensions on other issues, human rights in the U.S. China situation, and also on trade and other geopolitics, on technology. And so it's really difficult to predict. And so as Scott also writes about this in his book, which is, yeah, we have to also think more creatively about how we fill in some of these gaps in action when you do have competitive tensions arise that then make I think progress on climate change cooperation more challenging. And so a prime example was during the 2016 to 2020 Trump administration, when the United States pulled out of the Paris Agreement and did not engage meaningfully at the national level on climate change with China or other countries, and also globally. And during that time, you had then California Governor Jerry Brown kind of cede the role of being the national or the U.S. representative on climate action. And he held a very large summit in 2018 and invited a whole delegation from China. There were more than a dozen memorandums of understanding signed on emissions trading between California and China, electric vehicles, zero emissions vehicles, a lot of cooperative MOUs that were signed. And there was a lot of these types of exchanges on business to business and also subnational to subnational still going on in the absence of meaningful national engagement. So I think we just have to, this is the reality of the world, is that there's a lot of fragmentation geopolitically. And so we have to also think creatively and find other ways where we can still make progress that are not so reliant on national governments necessarily always coming and agreeing and seeing eye to eye.
Scott, cooperation versus competition.
So, well, this is actually how I sort of start China's Next Act. I talk about competition, cooperation. I also talk about a third mode of interaction, which is conflict. And we've sort of briefly alluded to that in some of the previous panels. I unfortunately think you cannot discount that scenario between the U.S. and China. And I should maybe clarify, I'm not necessarily speaking of like kinetic armed conflict, but just a situation in which we really lose all will to have constructive dialogue or engagement of any kind, and really do aim principally to ensure that the other side is hurt or degraded. Angel mentioned rightly that climate change used to be thought of as the principal bright spot in the U.S. China relationship. And unfortunately, now it's not. It's interesting to note, Secretary Yellen's speech has been referenced a couple of times, and reading that, I was reminded of two things. One, about a third of her remarks are devoted to sort of climate change and other, kind of shared global challenges, but climate change is clearly the centerpiece of that. And it's interesting, like, just to think about how central climate change has become to the overall U.S.-China bilateral relationship. And certainly that's been true for a while, but it's somewhat new to say that, you could have the Secretary of Treasury give a speech on U.S.-China relations and devote about a third of it to climate change. That's sort of, in some ways, I guess, a good news. The bad news is that as it's become more central to the bilateral relationship, it has become more colored by geopolitics and rivalry. And I'll just note the way that Secretary Yellen phrased it is, we want cooperation on climate not as a favor to us, but out of duty and obligation to the planet. And I think that phrasing, not as a favor to us, is an interesting reflection of the message that apparently the U.S. government is getting from their Chinese interlocutors as to how climate is sort of linked to other issues. And Angel pointed this out. So, I hope and think we can get, sort of make some progress despite this. I think I would second Angel's recommendation to sort of focus on subnational, non-state, industry association-led initiatives. And I also think multilateral action. We often think, U.S., China, world's two biggest emitters, we should really be doing a lot together. But I think the reality of climate policy, particularly as we've seen a shift toward adaptation in the global agenda, really requires a more multilateral approach. And I think there are some promising areas. The PBOC, China's central bank, has been really a leading actor on green finance through the G20. And so I think there are multilateral initiatives that can be promising areas of advancing dialogue as well, even if it's not direct U.S., kind of China bilateral, and doesn't have the same impact, that we have seen in the past, where U.S.-China bilateral engagement really drove the Paris Agreement and to some degree the Glasgow.
And just a quick
agreement.
follow-up. This escalation scenario that has been discussed numerous times during this conference, I would imagine all three of you would agree that that would be very bad for our ability as a global community to address climate change. Do you think climate change as an issue could help de-escalate? Like that as we approach a precipice here, the recognition that this would just make our ability to address climate change probably just that much harder would cause the parties to back off the ledge?
Well, I used to think that. I don't think that after Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, when climate was included on the list of retaliatory measures. Now, it was climate talks were suspended. They've now been restarted. But I think, Secretary Yellen's statements and other things that we've heard John Kerry say, suggest that it's not what it was, even prior to that. And I think, again, unfortunately, what we've seen is that geopolitics is sort of starting to shape climate as much, well, maybe not as much, but it's sort of on the list of dimensions of climate policy. It used to be mostly economic, energy, certainly ecology, but now we have to add geopolitics to that list, and that's really complicating things quite a bit. So I think my short answer is no. I don't think it's going to be an area where we can de-escalate. I do think, though, there's some opportunity, and Angel may have some thoughts on this, Joanna, as well, for thinking about some U.S. China efforts in other environmental areas, biodiversity. It's interesting, actually, the last major U.S. China statement on climate at Glasgow referenced like deforestation, action on deforestation. And I think those kind of areas that aren't necessarily directly tied to energy or mitigation can be promising because they're less political and less politicized. So I do think there's some hope there.
And so, Scott, I'm glad we had a more positive upswing there.
Yeah, I had to dig deep for you, Mike, but I got there. Yeah,
Joanna, your book is about cooperation and coordination. So make us feel better. Can we make us feel better here? What's the prospects here?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, so yes, I have a new book called Cooperating for the Climate, which looks at 3 decades of bilateral cooperation, not just between the US and China, but I take a global approach at how other countries have been engaging bilaterally with China. And I think this is really important for 2 reasons. I mean, first of all, we're in this situation today where our government is trying to figure out, can we cooperate? Should we cooperate? What should this look like? And, why aren't we looking at our recent history of experience in what has worked, what hasn't worked? Nobody had really tried to archive that and analyze that. So that's what I hope this book does. We develop a database of all the bilateral agreements that have been signed with China in the climate energy space. And then I analyze a few specific cases with different countries that I think, really extract some interesting lessons of how bilateral cooperation can be designed. And I would push back a little on the, we should just sort of do subnational and multilateral because it's easier. I think it's very important to do both of those things, absolutely. But I think there's just so much we can get out of the bilateral. And if we're not engaging bilaterally with China, we, the United States government, I will say I don't speak for the US government, but if they're not engaging bilaterally, there's just so much misinformation out there. And, I think COVID has been a real problem because we haven't had delegations going back and forth. Transparency is way down. And there's just not a good understanding of, these are technical issues, ultimately, emissions inventories, policy design is very complex and not something that we can fully understand without this sort of very deep technical engagement. And we've done that in the past, and so, I think that's just key to understand what has worked and what can change. And then again, this sort of global look outside the US, how other countries have engaged with China, I think is very important for US policymakers because we are not the only ones who engage bilaterally, and there's been very different models of how you might sort of move the needle on China's, energy system emissions trajectory to decarbonize. There's the way, and the U.S. has done very ambitious things in the R&D space. We had something called the U.S. China Clean Energy Research Center, which spanned both the Obama and the Trump administrations. And involved hundreds of researchers from both countries to jointly develop, demonstrate, and deploy a variety of clean energy technologies of mutual interest to both countries. We've had Denmark set up a clean energy research center embedded within the Chinese government, within the most powerful energy agency there to try to influence low carbon policy. We've even had Brazil work in the research space and develop a clean energy research center to take technologies across clean energy, but specifically in the biofuel space that were actually developed in China, pilot them and launch them in Brazil. So, you have this like very interesting models of South-South cooperation as well. So, I think there's just a lot we can learn from how we've done cooperation and how that can be applied to this moment in our sort of broader U.S. China relationship, and not sort of dismiss the risks that can be associated with science and technology cooperation, but instead design our cooperation mechanisms in a smart way that either addresses those risks head on or actually addresses other really important aspects of the climate fight, like regulatory and policy implementation, which doesn't have IP associated with it, but is actually where a lot of the sticking points are right now, I think, in China's low carbon transition.
So I'm going to give you one that's going to be a hard one in terms of cooperation. I get this all the time: nuclear. And so the question is, you don't see much in the media talking about the developments of the Chinese deployment of nuclear energy. Where does nuclear fit in this global effort to decarbonize? And I'll leave this. Who wants to take this one first?
I can start, but yeah, everyone's like, no. So, I specifically don't look at nuclear cooperation in the book because there's a whole separate set of economic and security risks that I think you have to look at nuclear in a very different way. But that said, China is now one of the few countries in the world that is building new nuclear power plants. They've had a very long-term concerted effort to build up a civilian nuclear power industry. But they've been actually not meeting their own targets. Like they had very ambitious targets, but it's proven to be more challenging than they expected. I think nuclear is China's leadership hopes that will be a part of their low carbon energy transition, because there are some advantages to nuclear providing, very large scale sources of electricity that's zero carbon. It has, of course, many other potential externalities. And there's been some public opposition as well, which, again, is hard to sort of get a good read on coming out of China, but has been an issue. Where do you cite these things? There's sort of limited citing, particularly in high density population areas. So, and then of course, when you had the nuclear disaster in Japan, China actually halted a lot of what they were doing to sort of analyze that and see if they should rethink. But they are still moving forward, and I think it will be ultimately an important part. But right now, China gets more electricity from wind and solar than they do from nuclear power.
Any other thoughts on nuclear power?
I had maybe just two very quick things. So a few years ago, and I confess I forget exactly when, I think shortly before the pandemic, one of those years, China's National sort of Science Foundation announced that it was going to build a thorium reactor. So this is interesting because in principle, there's no reason why you have to run fission power off of uranium fuel cycles. There are other elements you can use to run fuel cycles. And it's sort of, there are many reasons, but a lot of them just have to do with path dependency that we use uranium. If you used alternative fuel cycles, in principle, it could be cheaper and certainly less susceptible to proliferation risks. Some of the waste disposal issues would be mitigated in principle. The U.S. had a thorium research reactor that closed, I believe, in 1969. So it's interesting that China has made this investment. And I think it's while it's very unlikely that that will emerge and become a sort of commercial technology, the fact that in principle it promises to solve some of the major sort of issues around nuclear makes it, to me, an interesting example of some of those like moonshots that, even though there's a very small chance they will kind of become significant solutions to our mitigation problem. I don't know, maybe, there's some fractional chance. And I think just the kind of barriers that we've talked about just make it exceedingly unlikely that in that event it will be kind of be able to be deployed globally. The second thing I'll just note quickly, and it actually has more to do with radiological materials than sort of nuclear waste or anything per se, but prior to the Trump administration, nuclear security cooperation was a huge success story between the U.S. and China. I confess I can't speak to it authoritatively since then, because a lot of it's very sort of hard to get a window onto from the outside. But I think it's an interesting example of where in a very narrow technical issue area, cooperation was exceedingly good. And I think it's, we should try to learn from it as much as possible.
Well, let me turn to another question here from the audience. I mentioned before the EU border adjustment tax. This is now framing it more from the U.S. perspective. And you hear the rhetoric about how the industrial policy of China allowed them to dominate solar because they basically were heavily subsidizing it, driving the price down in markets and forcing out any global players. How would China react at this point if we started to put these types of, either revisit the tariff idea or a border adjustment tax for their products, if this is now becoming this competitive domain where industrial policy is trying to determine winners or losers? Maybe Angel's looking to hear on the nuclear side. Thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, as Scott said, it's been difficult to really get an inside view. So actually, I'm really curious to know what Joanna's thoughts are. I mean, China is just so dominant, as we started this panel with, in all of these types of technologies. And so they really have a huge competitive advantage. And so, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it would be really interesting. I'm planning on going to Beijing in June. So this is something that's definitely on my mind, is just hearing reactions of the Chinese counterparts on the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, I know they definitely have studied it very closely. And I've had colleagues who have been to China who have been asked to brief Chinese colleagues on the Inflation Reduction Act and what it actually means. And I mean, it's a very complex piece of legislation, even the content requirements. I've heard that the auto manufacturers like GM, they have to create a website to list exactly which vehicles qualify for these tax credits to try to inform the American consumers. And then even that's like a moving target, and it's changing every single day. And so I'm not sure yet exactly what, but I think at least on the international level, what I was hearing at COP27 from the few Chinese colleagues who were there is that there was, I think, a lot of support from China on the IRA and actually re-engaging on climate change and having national legislation. I mean, that certainly did mean a lot internationally to start to rebuild some of that trust that was lost over the previous years. But yeah, I'd be curious to hear what Joanna and Scott say in response to this question.
Yeah, thanks, Angel. You know, I mean, I guess just one thought on the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanisms. You know, these are not new, right? Like, we've been talking about these in the U.S. for a long time, including in a lot of the early cap and trade bills. There was sort of always like a China provision to these bills, because the concern in the U.S. had always been, if we're going to implement an ambitious climate policy, we don't want to put ourselves, you know, at a disadvantage with China, in that, you know, our companies would be subject to these carbon pricing restrictions and China's wouldn't, right? Fast forward, you know, 10, 15 years, and China has now launched the largest carbon market in the world, and we don't have, you know, we have a couple small regional carbon markets around a few U.S. states, but you know, I think that, I mean, people I've talked to from China are very wary of a CBAM, because, you know, we framed it from the beginning, and both the United States and the EU framed it from the beginning as a sort of a, you know, China retaliatory, you know, level the playing field measure that we're going to tack on to our own domestic legislation. But actually now, you know, I actually think, because the way it's designed, right, is that you're essentially, things can move across the border if they have, you know, equal or lower carbon intensity or embodied carbon sort of within the products. And whereas, you know, 10 years ago, China would have been much more carbon intensive and had to pay a large penalty at the border to import that to the US, it actually, that may be reversed now, because, you know, that we are, and the Chinese carbon, you know, the emissions trading system it's been gradual to roll out. It has its issues, but the plan is that we'll ultimately cover 8 sectors, including many of the heavily traded industrial sectors, and that could actually, you know, mean that these instruments wouldn't affect China in the way that we had, you know, were concerned about them doing so a decade plus ago. And you know, we see some interesting policies, like the U.S. and the EU signed this green steel agreement recently, which I don't know if you noticed. It was a, you know, a trade agreement that would essentially, you know, it would create like a higher standard for green steel that's traded between the countries. And again, in sort of an attempt to, as opposed to a race to the bottom, to really try to encourage the trade in lower carbon intensive heavy industrial products. And, and both countries, as I understand it, have sort of said, well, China, you're welcome to join this agreement if you can meet these standards and agree to them. And that's sort of a constructive way, I think, of actually doing trade policy, because then rather than just sort of slapping on tariffs, you actually are encouraging greener products to be the ones that have a trade advantage.
Scott, we're running out of time. I'm going to give you last question, and I'm going to ask a different quick question, one of my favorites. Give you the magic wand. If you could change one thing about U.S.-China relationships as it relates to this issue to advance our addressing of climate change, what would it be?
So I really would, and I mean, I certainly don't disagree with Joanna, and I think we should keep pushing for bilateral engagement and not give up on it. I absolutely agree with that. But I do think in the interim, I think we should push much more in multilateral fora. And I think we can do a lot more with sectoral initiatives. I think that's an underutilized space to pursue. Green steel, I think, is a good example. And I think there are lots of others that we could usefully pursue. So that's really my sort of top I think pick, maybe along with, I think expanding the aperture of U.S.-China climate cooperation to include some biodiversity and sort of land use change emissions issues, I think can be helpful.
Great, wonderful. Well, please join me in giving a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you for your time. I believe this concludes our conference, but I know Anna wants to give a last set of comments here.
Well, I just wanted to thank all of our participants and our terrific panelists for a really inspiring and exciting day. I want to thank the Miller Center and the Stevenson family for affording us this opportunity for this rich engagement. And I look forward to seeing all of you at future events at the Miller Center. Please stay tuned to all of our programming. This event will also be available on YouTube if you want to share it or share it with any friends or colleagues. So thank you again for all of your time and attention, and we look forward to seeing you at a future event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.